Chapter 2, Nha Trang, March 25th, 1975. A frightening cluster of explosions jolted me out of a deep sleep. I jumped out of bed, dimly aware of my surroundings. Through the window, the sky flickered with faint stars. I wondered if the noises I had just heard were merely a figment of my imagination. More gunshots rang out, and terror awakened me with full force. I groped for my sandals in the darkness, yelping for my mother. A figure bolted into my room holding a candle in her hand. It was Luan, my nanny, who at 18 was also the youngest maid in our house. Her hair was tangled and sleep hadn't completely washed from her face. In the dimly lit room, she looked bewildered and shaken. I ran toward her to bury myself in her bosom and inhaled the soothing, familiar scent of her body. We huddled together in the middle of the room. For over a month, gunshots and bombs had been heard all over Nha Trang. Every day the media had delivered more disturbing news, until numbness had infected everyone like a plague. People learned to follow the latest reports with silent and bitter acceptance. Rumors spread wildly through Nha Trang, eating through the city like cancer. Since there were no guards, the prison doors were unlocked. Felons trickled out like dirty water, robbing the city mercilessly. No one dared to venture outside. The streets were deserted, except for an occasional fast-moving car. Locked houses attested to their owners' fear. Television brought us scenes of towns near the war zone, where panicked citizens burst from their doors in the middle of the night, carrying nothing but their infants. The refugees, with bare feet and empty hands, rushed from one city to the next, running away from the invisible terror with no idea of where they were going or what they were fleeing. Finding food became a constant worry, since the markets no longer operated regularly. The city was like a fish dying on hard pavement, hopelessly gasping for air. Like most people in Nha Trang, we had bolted ourselves inside our home and waited for the horror of war to manifest its fury. So far, only some of its impact had torn through the protective shield of the Wynn mansion. I recall the first and most awful incident that shook my mother's sense of security, the crumbling of her bank. Since 1968, she had been the co-president of a small privately owned bank in Nha Trang. Half of the bank's assets were in her name, and a rich Chinese couple owned the other half. Late one evening, my mother received a phone call informing her that her partners were in Thailand on their way to New York with all the cash. The next day, she walked into her office to find herself standing in a deserted, garbage-filled wreck. Outside, hundreds of angry customers were screaming her name as they fought to get through the locked doors. Mere seconds ahead of the mob, my mother exited the bank through an escape door. She was physically unscathed, but this incident nearly destroyed her defiant spirit. I watched my mother from the balcony of my bedroom as she walked back to the house. One of her shoes was missing. Blank stare hollowed her face. Lam, her live-in boyfriend, a man 10 years her junior, and his friends were sunbathing by the pool when my mother passed them, lost in her trance. They stared at her until she disappeared in the house. Only when her feet touched the cold tiles in the living room did she collapse in sobbing howls. An overwhelming despair engulfed me like a black hole. From my second-floor balcony, I began to cry with her, only to realize that a much more ferocious noise was drowning out what little sound I made, the boom of angry explosive weapons. Down the street, a bomb went off, shaking the ground with vicious force. Now the same unsettling rumble had hurtled me from my bed and into Luan's arms. Luan carried me downstairs to the living room to look for my mother, who was hosting a party of sorts. In her search for information, she had gathered together the few officials left in Nha Trang. Sitting in a chair, she was dressed humbly in a traditional Vietnamese áo dài, a type of dress with a long skirt split from the waist to form two panels and worn over black pants. My mother was about 4 months along in her pregnancy, and her belly pushed upward beneath the silky fabric of her clothes. She was in the middle of a conversation with Mr. Daong, the chief translator for the U.S. Embassy. Mr. and Mrs. Daong were among my mother's important allies. Her heart had no room for any relationship stronger than a detached friendship, and she admitted to me on several occasions that this deficiency was innate to her personality, except that, in her own words, it was not a deficiency, but a successful adaptation to life. My mother was simply unable to trust anyone but herself. The relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Daong and my mother was strictly business. Because of his work, Mr. Daong was able to provide my mother with the latest top-secret news about the nation, the markets, and the key people involved, which included everyone at the party. Thus, my mother got her news delivered firsthand, first class. In return, Mr. Daong got to see the inside of my mother's bedroom, where he was able to confirm that her nightgown fit flawlessly over her shapely body, just as it had been described at the men's mahjong tables. As for Mrs. Daong, she was always the most significant and interesting guest at any of my mother's gatherings. At that moment, with her half-filled champagne glass positioned dangerously over her large bosom, Mrs. Daong stood a few feet away from her husband, leaning on Lom and another male guest for support. Each time Lom or his friend whispered something in her ear, her exaggerated laughter would break out like shattered glass. Sitting nearby, my mother and Mrs. Daong's husband, lost in their intense conversation, seemed to disregard the tumultuous scene that was happening around them. "Mommy," I called out from the door. My mother excused herself and got up to walk over to us. In Luan's embrace, I could feel the tension shooting through the maid's body as my mother approached. Before Luan could say anything, my mother reached out to snatch me away. With an icy stare, she growled almost inaudibly in the maid's ear, "Get out." She whirled around and returned to her company, holding me in her arms as though nothing significant had happened. To Mr. Daong, she said, "I am sorry. My son got frightened." "Well, at this point, madam, he is not the only one," Mr. Daong said with a sigh. "You know you should get out of here before it's too late." "Why? What about the Americans? Aren't they helping us?" Mr. Daong gave my mother the same look he would give to someone who was crazy or just incredibly stupid. "What do you mean by the Americans? They left us long ago. We haven't received any help since 1972. We are on our own and falling fast." "But," my mother stammered, covering my ears with her hands, as though to stop both of us from understanding the severity of the situation. "Exactly my point. You and your family have to get out of here soon. The Kong have claimed Qui Nguyen City and Tui Hua, too. Only a few short miles through the jungle, and they will be here soon." My mother uttered a small cry. Her hands tightened around my ears, but I could hear the anguish in her voice as she cried, "Dear God, what should I do?" "I've told you, madam. All we can do right now is run like the wind. As for my family, we are leaving early tomorrow morning. I suggest you do the same. Where should I go? Well, first go to Saigon. At least there you can always leave Vietnam through the main airport. On the other hand, if the political situation ever improves, you can come back to Nha Trang. I have nothing left here to come back to, my mother said. I lost my bank and all of my money. Mr. Duong shrugged to emphasize his helplessness. More reason to leave this condemned place. Please, don't forget to keep in touch with us in Saigon. This is the address where we will be staying. He scribbled on the back of a business card and handed it to her. That night, even though several guests were still at the party, my mother sent Lum out to rent a minivan. A large vehicle seemed to be the only way for my mother to transport the 6 of us, including her boyfriend. The moment Lum came back with the van, we rushed to get inside, carrying only a few necessities. As we followed some of our departing guests down the driveway, not a soul in the house knew of our impetuous plan. Most of the servants were already in bed by the time the party began. Suddenly, from out of nowhere, Luan ran out in front of the van, tearfully begging my mother for permission to come along. For 8 years, she had been a charming addition to my family, showing kindness to us all, even my mother, who despised anyone beneath her. As long as I could remember, Luan had been one of us. In her seat, my mother viewed the uncomfortable scene unmoved. However, Luan's cries affected my grandparents, and my grandfather spoke up on her behalf. Confronted with his calm and determined intervention, my mother agreed to take Luan with us. Once inside, the maid embraced my brother and me tightly. She kissed us with tears on her cheeks before turning to my mother and bowing down to press her face to my mother's hands. The moment the girl's lips touched her hands, my mother pulled away, as if touched by fire. Her face darkened and her eyes burned at the girl with hatred. With a swift movement that startled everyone, my mother struck a hard blow across Luan's left cheek. The slap sent the girl's head backward to hit the van's steel wall with a cold and hollow noise. Somehow, Luan managed to keep her head bowed low to the ground. In the frightful silence, my brother began to cry softly with fear, but no one reached out to comfort him. I was too shocked to utter a sound.